I became a night shift pediatrician at St. Catherine's Children's Hospital 3 months ago, and I thought I'd seen everything the darkness could throw at me. Screaming kids with broken bones, parents in hysterics, the occasional cold blue that sends your heart racing until dawn. But nothing, and I mean absolutely nothing, prepared me for what I encountered in room 213. It started on a Tuesday night in late October, the kind of evening where fog rolls to the parking lot like something out of a horror movie, and fluorescent lights seemed dimmer than usual. I was making my rounds on the fourth floor, checking vitals and updating charts, when I heard it for the first time, a sound that would haunt me for weeks to come. It was laughter, children's laughter, coming from room 213, which shouldn't have been occupied at all according to the patient board. I remember stopping dead in my tracks outside that door, my hand hovering over the handle. The laughter wasn't the joyful kind you'd expect from kids watching cartoons or playing games. It was nervous, uncertain, like they were laughing because they didn't know what else to do. I could hear whispers too, urgent and hushed, the kind of conspiratorial tones children use when they're sharing secrets they think adults shouldn't hear. My rational mind told me there had been an administrative error, that someone had admitted patients without updating the system. But something else, some primal instinct I didn't even know I possessed, told me be careful. I pushed the door open slowly, letting it swing wide on its hinges, and what I saw made my breath catch in my throat. 3 children sat in hospital beds arranged in a semicircle, all of them staring at the far corner of the room. There was Emma, a 7-year-old with leukemia, whose chart I'd reviewed earlier that day. Next to her was Marcus, a 9-year-old recovering from appendicitis, his dark eyes wide and unblinking. And in the third bed was Lily, a 6-year-old who'd been admitted for severe asthma attacks. All 3 of them were completely still now. The laughter died away the moment I entered, replaced by a tension so thick I could feel it pressing against my skin. They weren't looking at me. They weren't looking at anything I could see. But they were definitely looking at something, and whatever it was, it terrified and fascinated them in equal measure. "Hey there," I said, forcing cheerfulness into my voice despite the unease crawling up my spine. "What are you all doing awake? It's way past bedtime." Emma was the first to break her stare, turning to look at me with eyes that seemed far too old for her small face. She glanced back at the corner, then at me again, as if trying to decide whether to tell me something important. Marcus shifted in his bed, pulling his blanket up to his chin, while Lily just kept staring, her breathing slightly labored even with the oxygen cannula in her nose. The silence stretched out between us, elastic and uncomfortable, until finally Emma spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "She's here again. Dr. Matthews," Emma said, and I noticed her hands were trembling slightly as she gripped her bedsheet. "The lady in the corner. She comes every night when it gets really dark." My stomach dropped, and I felt goosebumps rise on my arms despite the warmth of the room. I turned to look at the corner they'd been staring at, seeing nothing but shadows and the standard hospital furniture, a chair, a small table, the emergency equipment cart. There was no one there. No nurse, no visitor, no cleaning staff. Just empty space and the soft hum of medical equipment. I looked back at the children, all 3 of them now watching me carefully, gauging my reaction. "What lady?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady and professional. "There's no one here but us, sweetie." Marcus shook his head vigorously, his voice cracking slightly as he spoke. "She's there right now, Dr. Matthews. She's wearing an old-fashioned nurse uniform, like from really long ago. White dress, white hat, white shoes, but her face." He trailed off, looking scared to continue. Lily finally spoke up, her small voice barely audible over the beep of her heart monitor. "Her face is sad. So sad. And she keeps trying to tell us something, but we can't hear the words." I stood there in that hospital room, my medical training warring with something else, a creeping dread that made my hands feel cold. I walked over the corner, waving my hand through the empty space, demonstrating that nothing was there. The children watched me with expressions that mixed pity and fear, as if I was the one who couldn't see reality clearly. I checked each of their charts, looking for medications that might cause hallucinations, checking their vital signs for any indication of fever or infection that could cause delirium. Everything was normal. Their temperatures were stable, their medications were standard, their mental status exams from earlier in the day had been completely unremarkable. There was no medical explanation for why all three of them would be experiencing the same hallucination at the same time. I spent the rest of that night researching everything I could find about room 213. My laptop screen glowed blue in the dim nurse's station, casting shadows across the empty coffee cups and scattered patient files. I started with the hospital's digital archives, searching through years of admission records, incident reports, and maintenance logs. St. Catherine's had been around since 1952, and room 213 had been part of the original construction. What I found in those records made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Over the past 70 years, there had been dozens of reports from pediatric patients about seeing a woman in that room. Most of them were dismissed as night terrors, fever dreams, or the overactive imaginations of sick children. But the consistency was impossible to ignore. The reports all described the same figure, a nurse in an old-fashioned uniform, always appearing in the corner of the room, always silent, always sad. I found a report from 1968 where a 10-year-old boy drew a picture of her, the crude crayon sketch showing a woman with tears running down her face. Another from 1983 detailed how 3 children, just like tonight, all insisted they could see someone the adults couldn't. A more recent report from 2019 mentioned a girl who claimed a nurse was trying to warn her about something, though the child couldn't understand what. I printed out pages of these reports, spreading them across the desk, trying to find a pattern or explanation. The rational part of my brain screamed that this had to be some kind of mass hysteria, a story passed down between young patients that took root in vulnerable, frightened minds. But then I found something that changed everything. Buried in a manila folder marked Personnel Records Archived, I discovered information about a nurse named Catherine Hendricks who had worked at St. Catherine's in the 1950s. The file was thin, containing only basic employment information and a single black and white photograph. The moment I saw that photograph, my blood ran cold. The woman staring back at me from the faded image wore the exact uniform the children had described. White dress, white cap, white shoes. Her face, even in the grainy photo, carried an unmistakable sadness in her eyes. According to the records, Catherine Hendricks had been one of the hospital's most dedicated pediatric nurses, working primarily on the 4th floor. The file contained one final document that made my hands shake as I held it. It was an incident report dated March 15th, 1957, written in crisp, formal language that couldn't quite hide the tragedy it described. Catherine Hendricks had been working a night shift when a fire broke out in what was then the pediatric ward. The fire started in the electrical system, spreading rapidly through the old wooden infrastructure. Nurse Hendricks had managed to evacuate 12 children from the ward, making trip after trip through smoke and flames. But when she went back for the 13th child, a little boy named Thomas Mitchell, who was in what is now room 213, part of the ceiling collapsed. Neither Catherine nor Thomas made out. Their bodies were found together, the nurse's arms wrapped protectively around the child. I sat back in my chair, the incident report trembling in my hands, and tried to process what I'd learned. The hospital had been rebuilt after the fire, modernized with sprinkler systems and fire-resistant materials, but they had kept the same room numbering system. Room 213 occupied the exact same location where Catherine Hendricks had died trying to save a child. I looked at the clock. It was 3:47 a.m., the dead hours of the night when the hospital felt most like a ghost of itself. I needed to talk to someone who'd worked here longer than me, someone who might know more about the hospital's history. I thought of Margaret Chun, the head nurse who'd been at St. Catherine's for over 30 years. She'd see me as crazy, but I had to try. I found Margaret in the break room, nursing a cup of coffee and reviewing the next day's schedule. She looked up when I entered, her experienced eyes immediately reading the tension in my posture. "Dr. Matthews," she said, setting down her coffee. "You look like you've seen a ghost. What's wrong?" I almost laughed at the unintentional irony of her words. Instead, I sat down across from her and spread out the documents I'd printed. I told her everything. About the children in room 213, about the reports I'd found, about Catherine Hendricks and the fire. Margaret listened without interrupting, her expression growing more serious with each word. When I finished, Margaret was quiet for a long moment, staring down at the photograph of Catherine Hendricks. Finally, she spoke, her voice carrying the weight of years of unspoken knowledge. "I've been working here since 1994, she said slowly. "And in all that time, I've heard stories about room 213. Whispers among the staff, accounts from children that we dismiss as dreams. Most of us try not to think about it too much." She looked up at me, and I saw something in her eyes. Not fear exactly, but a kind of respectful wariness. "But there's something you should know, Dr. Matthews. Every time children report seeing the nurse, something bad happens shortly after: an equipment failure, a medication error, a sudden deterioration in a patient's condition. It's like she's trying to warn us." Margaret's words sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. I thought about Emma, Marcus, and Lily, all of them staring at that empty corner, insisting they could see someone I couldn't. "Has anyone ever figured out what she's warning about?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. Margaret shook her head, her expression troubled. "That's the thing. By the time we realize there's a pattern, the incident has already occurred. We can never get ahead of it. And Dr. Matthews?" She leaned forward, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "The last time 3 children saw her simultaneously, like tonight, was in 2015. 2 days later, there was a carbon monoxide leak in the ventilation system on the 4th floor. If a maintenance worker hadn't noticed it by pure chance, every child on that floor could have died." I didn't sleep that day. While my colleagues went home to their warm beds and normal lives, I sat in my apartment staring at the wall, my mind racing through possibilities. Carbon monoxide leak, equipment failure, medication error. What was Catherine Hendricks trying to warn us about this time? I thought about those 3 children, all of them able to see something I couldn't, all of them frightened but also strangely calm, as if they understood they were witnesses to something important. The rational doctor in me still wanted to dismiss this as coincidence and confirmation bias, but I couldn't ignore the growing certainty in my gut that something was very wrong at St. Catherine's. When evening came and it was time to return for my shift, I felt like I was walking into a trap. The hospital seemed different that night, or maybe I was just seeing it with new eyes. Every shadow felt significant. Every unexpected sound made me jump. I went straight to room 213, where Emma, Marcus, and Lily were still assigned. They were awake when I entered, even though it was barely 8 p.m. Emma looked at me with those 2 knowing eyes and said simply, "You believe us now, don't you?" I didn't know how to answer that, so instead I pulled up a chair and sat down. "Tell me everything you can about the nurse," I said. "Every detail, no matter how small it seems." The children looked at each other, some unspoken communication passing between them, before Marcus began to speak. "She appears around 10 p.m., sometimes a little earlier," he said. "At first she's just standing in the corner, really still like a statue. Then after a while, she starts moving." He demonstrated with his hands, showing how the figure would turn slowly, scanning the room. "She looks at each of us, one at a time, and her mouth moves like she's trying to talk. But there's no sound, or maybe there is, but we can't quite hear it." Lily nodded in agreement, adding, "Sometimes she points at things. Last night she kept pointing at the wall, over and over." Emma, who seemed to be the most perceptive of the 3, leaned forward and spoke in a hushed voice. "I think she's stuck, Dr. Matthews. I think she's trying to save us, just like she tried to save that boy in the fire. My mom tells me stories about angels and spirits, and I think Nurse Catherine is like that. She can't rest because she thinks there are still children in danger. The sincerity in Emma's voice, the complete lack of doubt or fear in her conviction, struck me deeply. I looked at the corner where they claimed Catherine appeared, seeing nothing but empty space, and felt profound frustration at my own limitations. I decided to try something that would probably get me fired if anyone found out. At 9:45 p.m., I set up a video camera in room 213, positioning it to capture the corner where the children claimed to see Catherine Hendricks. I told them what I was doing, and they watched with interest as I adjusted the angle and checked the battery. Will the camera see her? Lily asked. I honestly didn't know how to answer. I don't know, sweetie, but maybe it'll see something we're missing. I also brought in additional monitoring equipment, a thermal camera borrowed from the maintenance department, an electromagnetic field detector I'd ordered online during my lunch break, and even a simple audio recorder. If there was something happening in this room, I was determined to document it. As 10 p.m. approached, I could feel the tension in the room building. The children grew quieter, their eyes fixed on the corner. I stood by the window, watching them, and occasionally glancing at the corner myself, straining to see anything unusual. And then, at 10:03 p.m., all three children suddenly sat up straighter. She's here, Emma whispered. I looked at the corner and saw nothing. I looked at my equipment. The thermal camera showed no heat signature. The EMF detector remained silent. The regular camera captured only empty space. But the children's reactions were undeniable. They were all tracking something with their eyes, something that moved from the corner toward the center of the room. Marcus suddenly pointed and said, Dr. Matthews, she's pointing at the wall again, the wall behind Lily's bed. I turned to look at the wall, which appeared completely normal. Standard hospital paint, mounted medical equipment, the oxygen outlets and electrical sockets. But then I noticed something. The electrical socket behind Lily's bed had a small scorch mark around it, barely visible unless you looked closely. My heart started racing. I walked over and knelt down, examining the socket more carefully. The plastic was slightly warped, and when I touched the wall near it, the paint felt warm. Too warm. I immediately called maintenance, trying to keep my voice calm so as not to frighten the children. While I waited for them to arrive, Emma spoke up again. She's smiling now, Dr. Matthews. Nurse Catherine is smiling. I think she's happy you finally understood. The maintenance technician who arrived was a grizzled man named Ed who'd worked at St. Catherine's since the 1990s. He took one look at the socket, and his expression turned grave. He pulled out a voltage tester and began checking the outlet, then the ones next to it. After a few minutes of testing, he stood up and looked at me with serious eyes. Dr. Matthews, we need to evacuate this room immediately. Actually, we need to evacuate the entire wing. There's a major electrical fault in the wiring behind this wall. From what I can see, it's been arcing and building up heat. If this had gone on much longer, he didn't need to finish the sentence. The next hour was controlled chaos. Margaret Chin mobilized the nursing staff with the efficiency of a general commanding troops, while I helped coordinate the movement of patients from the fourth floor east wing to other areas of the hospital. Emma, Marcus, and Lily were moved to rooms on the second floor, away from the danger. As orderlies wheeled their beds past me, Emma reached out and grabbed my hand. She saved us again, didn't she? The little girl said, her eyes bright despite her illness. Nurse Catherine saved us just like she saved those other kids in the fire. I squeezed her hand gently, unable to speak past a lump in my throat. Ed and his team worked through the night, opening up the wall to expose the full extent of the electrical damage. What they found was worse than anyone had expected. The wiring in that section of the wall dated back to a renovation in the 1980s and had been slowly deteriorating for years. The insulation had degraded, allowing bare wires to touch the metal studs in the wall. The heat buildup had been gradual but relentless, creating a fire hazard that could have ignited at any moment. If the children had been sleeping, if no one had been watching, If I hadn't noticed that scorch mark, the outcome could have been catastrophic. Another few days, Ed told me grimly, and this whole wing would have gone up in flames. You saved lives tonight, Dr. Matthews. But I hadn't saved anyone. 3 children with the inexplicable ability to see beyond the veil of death had witnessed a warning that I'd almost dismissed as hallucination. A nurse who died 70 years ago trying to protect children had somehow reached across the divide to warn us of danger. I stood in the empty hallway outside room 213, staring at the plastic sheeting that now covered the doorway, and tried to make sense of what had happened. My medical training, my years of education, my rational scientific mind, none of it had prepared me for this. I thought about all those reports I'd found, all those children over the decades who'd seen Catherine Hendricks and been dismissed as confused or imaginative or disturbed. Margaret found me there around 4 a.m., standing vigil outside a room that no longer existed as it had. She handed me a cup of coffee and stood beside me in silence for a moment. Then she said, "You did good tonight, Dr. Matthews. You listened when you could have dismissed them. You investigated when you could have ignored it. That's what makes a good doctor, being open to things we don't understand." I took a sip of the coffee, letting its warmth spread through me. "Margaret, how do I put this in my report? How do I explain that I found a major safety hazard because 3 children claimed to see a ghost?" She smiled slightly, a knowing look in her eyes. "You tell the truth. That patients reported unusual concerns about the room, that you investigated based on their reports and discovered the electrical fault. You don't need to explain more than that. The important thing is that children are safe because you paid attention." She paused and added, "But between you and me, Dr. Matthews, I think St. Catherine's has had a guardian angel all these years. Catherine Hendricks couldn't save that little boy in 1957, but she's been saving children ever since. Maybe that's why she can't rest. Maybe she won't rest until she's certain no more children will die in her hospital." I thought about Catherine Hendricks, about the choice she made in those final moments to go back for one more child, knowing she might not make it out. I thought about the dedication that would drive someone to continue protecting children even after death, appearing night after night in a corner of a room, desperately trying to warn anyone who could see her. "Do you think she knows we found problem?" I asked Margaret. "Do you think she knows the children are safe now?" Margaret looked at the plastic-covered doorway and said softly, "I think she knows. I think that's why Emma said she was smiling. The hospital kept the entire East Wing closed for 3 days while Ed's team completely rewired that section of the building. They found additional faults in the electrical system, corroded pipes, and outdated ventilation components, all potential hazards that could have caused serious harm. The maintenance department called it the most comprehensive safety upgrade the hospital had done in years. The administration, meanwhile, was simply grateful that the problem had been discovered before tragedy struck. They praised my keen observation skills and dedication to patient safety without ever knowing the real reason I'd been examining that wall. Emma, Marcus, and Lily were discharged over the course of that week, each of them recovering well from their respective conditions. On Emma's last day, as her parents were packing up her belongings, she pulled me aside. "I haven't seen Nurse Catherine since that night," she said. "I think maybe she's resting now, at least for a little while. She knows we're safe." The little girl hugged me tightly, and I felt tears prick my eyes. "You take care of yourself, Emma," I managed to say. "And remember, if you ever see something that adults can't see, don't be afraid to speak up. Sometimes kids see the truth that grown-ups miss." After the incident with room 213, I couldn't let it go. During my off hours, I became obsessed with learning everything I could about Catherine Hendricks and the 1957 fire. I visited the local historical society, pored over old newspaper archives, and even tracked down the daughter of a nurse who had worked with Catherine. What emerged was a portrait of an extraordinary woman who had dedicated her life to caring for children. Catherine had lost her own son to polio in 1955, and many of her colleagues believed she channeled her grief into her work, treating every child in her care as if they were her own. The fire that killed her was front-page news in March 1957. The articles described how Nurse Catherine Hendricks had become a hero in her final moments, personally evacuating a dozen children from the burning ward. Eyewitness accounts from other staff members painted a vivid picture of her courage. Running through smoke-filled hallways, her white uniform smudged with ash, always moving toward the danger rather than away from it. The little boy she died trying to save, Thomas Mitchell, was 5 years old and suffering from pneumonia. He'd been too weak to walk on his own, which was why Catherine had gone back for him. They found her body curled around his, her arms still wrapped protectively around the child. One detail from the newspaper accounts struck me particularly hard. According to the fire chief's report, if Nurse Hendricks hadn't raised the alarm and begun evacuating children when she did, the death toll would have been much higher. She had noticed the smell of smoke before fire alarms were triggered. Those old systems were notoriously slow, and her immediate action saved precious minutes. Even in her death, she was a guardian, a protector, someone who saw danger before others did. It seemed fitting, in a tragic way, that her spirit would continue to perform that same function, watching over the children in the hospital that bore her colleague's name. I also learned that St. Catherine's Children's Hospital had been named after Catherine's friend and fellow nurse, Catherine Sterling, who had survived the fire. After Catherine Hendricks' death, Catherine Sterling had advocated for better safety standards in hospitals, particularly in pediatric wings. She'd pushed for sprinkler systems, multiple exits, and fire-resistant construction materials. In many ways, the modern hospital's robust safety features were a direct result of the tragedy that claimed Catherine Hendricks' life. There was a certain poetry to it. Both Catherines, in their own ways, continuing to protect children long after the fire. I compiled all of this information into a personal journal, documenting not just the historical facts, but also the reports from children over the years, the patterns I'd observed, and my own experiences. I wasn't sure what I intended to do with this information. It felt important to record it, to acknowledge Catherine Hendricks' continued presence and her unceasing vigil over the children of St. Catherine's. Some truths exist outside the boundaries of medical science and peer-reviewed journals. Some truths live in the spaces between what we can prove and what we know in our bones to be real. Margaret Chen became something of a confidant during this time. She shared stories she'd heard over her 30 years at the hospital. Nurses who felt a sudden urge to check on a patient at an unusual hour and found a developing crisis. Doctors who changed a diagnosis at the last minute based on a hunch that saved a life. Staff members who reported feeling a presence in room 213 that made them more alert, more careful. I think the hospital is full of guardians, Margaret told me one night over coffee. Not just Catherine, though she's the most visible one. I think all the people who've worked here, who've cared for these children, leave something behind. Their dedication, their love, their vigilance. Maybe that's what a ghost really is, not a trapped soul, but persistence of care that transcends death. Her words resonated with me deeply. I thought about the concept of a hospital not just as a building, but as a living repository of all the compassion and expertise that had been practiced within its walls. Every nurse who'd stayed late to comfort a frightened child, every doctor who'd fought against impossible odds, every parent who'd kept vigil at the bedside, all of that emotion and intention soaked into the very fabric of the place. Maybe Catherine Hendricks wasn't alone in her eternal watch. Maybe she was just the one most visible to those with a particular kind of sight that sees beyond the mundane world. I also reached out to researchers who studied paranormal phenomena, though I was careful to maintain my anonymity. I learned about the concept of crisis apparitions, spirits that appear specifically to warn of danger. I read about places that seem to retain emotional imprints of traumatic events, creating what some investigators call residual hauntings. I studied reports from other hospitals around the world where staff and patients had experienced similar phenomena. What I found was that St. Catherine's was not unique. Hospitals, with their intense emotional experiences and frequent confrontations with mortality, seemed to be thin places where the boundary between the living and the dead became permeable. 2 months after the electrical fault was repaired, room 213 was reopened for patient use. The hospital administration had debated whether to retire the room number entirely, but ultimately decided against it. They'd installed state-of-the-art electrical systems, new medical equipment, and even repainted the walls in a cheerful yellow color. It looked nothing like the room where Catherine Hendricks had died, where generations of children had seen her sad face appearing in the corner. But I knew, as did anyone who'd worked at St. Catherine's long enough, that some things can't be renovated away. I volunteered to take the first patients assigned to room 213 after its reopening. I want to be there, to observe, to see if Catherine's presence would return now that children were once again sleeping in the space she died trying to protect. The first night, 2 patients were admitted. A 10-year-old boy named David recovering from a fractured femur, and an 8-year-old girl named Sophia who had surgery to remove her appendix. Both children were in good spirits, their parents staying with them until visiting hours ended at 9 p.m. After the families left, I made a point of checking on the room more frequently than necessary, watching and waiting. At 10:15 p.m., I was at the nurse's station when I heard David call out. His voice wasn't frightened exactly, but it carried an urgency that made me drop the chart I was reviewing and hurry to room 213. David was sitting up in his bed, his eyes fixed on the corner of the room, the same corner where children had seen Catherine for decades. Sophia was awake too, also staring at that spot with an expression of curiosity rather than fear. Dr. Matthews, David said when I entered, "There's a nurse over there, but she looks really old-fashioned. Is this like a historical demonstration or something?" My heart started pounding, but I kept my voice calm. "What does she look like, David?" The boy described her in detail. The white uniform, the white cap, the sad expression that made him feel like she was worried about something. Sophia nodded in agreement, adding, "She keeps looking at the new equipment, like she's checking to make sure everything is okay. Is she a safety inspector?" The innocence of the question almost made me laugh. In a way, Sophia was absolutely right. Catherine Hendricks was indeed a safety inspector, had been for 70 years, watching over children with eternal vigilance. I pulled up a chair between the 2 beds and made a decision that probably violated every protocol in my professional handbook. I told them the story of Catherine Hendricks. I explained who she was, what had happened in 1957, and how children over the years had reported seeing her in this room. I told them about the electrical fault she'd warned us about how her presence had saved Emma, Marcus, and Lily. David and Sophia listened with rapt attention, their eyes occasionally flicking to the corner where they claimed to see her. When I finished, David said thoughtfully, "So she's like a guardian angel, but for hospitals. That's actually pretty cool." Sophia had a different reaction. The little girl got out of her bed, moving carefully because of her recent surgery, and walked toward the corner. "Thank you, Nurse Catherine," she said clearly, addressing the empty space. "Thank you for watching over us and keeping us safe. You're a hero." For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. Then Sophia turned back to me with a smile and said, "She's smiling now, Dr. Matthews. I think she's happy that we know about her. She doesn't seem as sad anymore." I stayed in that room for another hour, talking with David and Sophia about courage, about dedication, about how some people's love is so strong it transcends even death. They asked insightful questions about what happens after we die, about whether other hospitals had guardian spirits, about whether Catherine could finally rest now that we knew her story. I answered as honestly as I could, acknowledging the limits of my knowledge, but also validating their experiences. As I finally prepared to leave so they could sleep, David said something that struck me profoundly. "I hope when I grow up, I care about something as much as Nurse Catherine cares about kids. That must be what it means to really matter." Over the following weeks, other children reported seeing Catherine in room 213. Not all of them. It seemed to be an ability limited to certain individuals, perhaps those more sensitive to whatever frequency the dead operate on. But those who did see her consistently describe her as watchful, protective, and increasingly less sad. It was as if being acknowledged, being known and appreciated for her eternal service, had brought her some measure of peace. The reports of her pointing at problems or showing agitation decreased. She simply appeared, watched over children, and faded away before morning. She had become what Sophia called her, a guardian angel for hospitals. Margaret Chun and I documented these observations carefully, creating what amounted to an unofficial record of Catherine's presence. We noted patterns in who could see her, when she appeared most frequently, and any changes in her behavior. It was unscientific in the traditional sense, but it felt important. We were bearing witness to something remarkable, something that existed in the margins of the medical world we thought we understood. And perhaps, by acknowledging her, by telling her story, we were helping Catherine Hendricks find a peace that had eluded her for 70 years. As word quietly spread among the St. Catherine staff about Room 213 and Catherine Hendricks, something unexpected happened. Other people began sharing their own experiences. A respiratory therapist told me about the third-floor storage closet, where he always felt compelled to double-check the oxygen tanks, only to frequently find problems with them. A surgical nurse described a recurring dream about a doctor who died during a pandemic in 1963, a dream that always preceded equipment malfunctions in the OR. An elderly janitor who'd worked at the hospital for 45 years told me about the little boy he sometimes saw in the old pediatric playroom, a child who died from leukemia in 1979 and seemed to appear whenever another child was struggling with similar feelings of isolation and fear. I began to realize that St. Catherine's Children's Hospital was not just one haunted room, but an entire building layered with presences, each connected to tragedies or powerful emotions from past. The hospital was a palimpsest of all the care, grief, hope, and dedication that had occurred within its walls over 70 years. These weren't malevolent spirits or trapped souls, but something more nuanced. Echoes of profound experiences, imprints of people whose connection to this place, and its mission was so intense it couldn't be entirely severed by death. They were guardians, all of them, watching over the vulnerable children who came through the doors seeking healing. I started interviewing patients too, particularly those children who seemed unusually perceptive or emotionally mature. Many of them, when asked the right questions in the right way, admitted to seeing or sensing things they thought adults would dismiss. A 12-year-old with cystic fibrosis told me about the cloud people she saw drifting through the hallways, checking on patients. A 7-year-old with a brain tumor described the warm spots in certain rooms that made him feel safe and loved. A 9-year-old recovering from a severe car accident talked about the helper friends who visited him at night, teaching him not to be afraid of his injuries. What struck me most was the comfort these experiences brought to the children. Rather than being frightened, they seemed to draw strength from these encounters. The idea that they were being watched over by benevolent presences helped them cope with the fear and uncertainty of their illnesses. In some cases, I observed measurable improvements in their recovery rates, their pain management, and their emotional well-being. Modern medicine recognizes the importance of the mind-body connection, of hope and belief in the healing process. Perhaps these supernatural encounters, or whatever we chose to call them, were actually therapeutic, providing a form of psychological and spiritual support that complemented the medical care we provided. I began to wonder about the broader implications of what I was observing. How many hospitals around the world had similar phenomena occurring? How many children's experiences had been dismissed as hallucinations or fantasy when they were actually perceiving something real, albeit in a way that challenged our materialistic understanding of reality? The more I investigated, the more I realized that children might be natural mediums for these experiences precisely because they hadn't yet learned to filter out such perceptions. Adults are taught that certain things are impossible, that death is a final ending, that consciousness ends when the brain stops functioning. Children, however, still operate with a more open worldview, one that allows for mysteries and magic. I presented my findings, carefully framed in academic language and stripped of any overtly supernatural claims, at a pediatric medicine conference 6 months after the Room 213 incident. My presentation was titled, the therapeutic value of validating pediatric patient perceptions, and focus on the psychological benefits of taking children's reported experiences seriously, regardless of their objective reality. The response was mixed. Some colleagues praised my compassionate approach to patient care. Others quietly suggested I was venturing into dangerous territory, that encouraging belief in ghosts or spirits was unprofessional and potentially harmful. But a surprising number of doctors and nurses approached me privately afterward, sharing their own stories of unexplained phenomena in their hospitals, experiences they'd never felt safe discussing publicly. One pediatric oncologist from Boston told me about a pattern she'd noticed in her ward. Children who reported seeing deceased family members during their final days consistently had more peaceful deaths, requiring less pain medication and showing less anxiety. A trauma surgeon from Miami described a photograph that hung in his hospital's emergency department, a picture of a nurse who died in the 1980s, and how patients would sometimes ask about the nurse in the old photo who visited them, even though the photograph wasn't visible from their treatment rooms. A hospice doctor from Seattle shared research she'd been compiling for years about deathbed visions and the striking consistency in what people reported seeing. We were all dancing around the same truth, trying to find ways to acknowledge something profound while remaining within the bounds of acceptable medical discourse. That conference marked a turning point for me. I realized I wasn't alone in my experiences, and more importantly, I understood that my role wasn't to prove or disprove the existence of Catherine Hendricks' spirit. My role was to listen to my patients, to validate their experiences, and to remain open to the possibility that healing involves more than just what we can measure with our instruments and prescribe with our medications. Whether Catherine was truly a ghost or simply a shared story that provided comfort to frightened children didn't matter as much as I'd initially thought. What mattered was that children felt protected, that staff remained vigilant, and that the legacy of a brave nurse continued to save lives decades after her death. Back at St. Catherine's, I implemented new protocols based on what I'd learned. I trained the nursing staff to ask children open-ended questions about what they were experiencing, without dismissing or immediately pathologizing their reports. I created a simple log where staff could note any unusual patient observations, patterns in equipment failures, or intuitive concerns about safety issues. I work with a hospital psychiatry department to develop guidelines for distinguishing between hallucinations that required medical intervention and perceptual experiences that, while unexplained, weren't causing distress or indicating underlying pathology. These changes were subtle but significant, creating space for experiences that had previously been ignored or dismissed. The most rewarding part of this new approach was seeing how it affected the children. When a patient told me they could see someone I couldn't, instead of immediately reaching for explanations involving fever or medication side effects, I would ask them to describe what they saw. I would listen carefully, observe their emotional state, and assess whether the experience was frightening or comforting. More often than not, these experiences fell into the latter category. Children would describe feeling watched over, protected, guided. They would report that the presences they perceived gave them courage when they were scared, comfort when they were in pain, and hope when treatment was difficult. As a physician, I had been trained to heal the body. I was learning that sometimes the most powerful healing addressed dimensions of human experience that transcended the purely physical. Margaret Chin retired a year after the Room 213 incident, and on her last day, she gave me something I'll treasure forever. It was a small photograph in an old frame, the original photograph of Catherine Hendricks that had been displayed in the hospital's lobby until the 1980s. "I want you to have this," Margaret said. "You're one of the few people who truly understands what she means to this place. Keep telling her story, Dr. Matthews. Make sure she's never forgotten." I placed the photograph in my office, on the shelf where I can see it every day. Catherine's sad eyes stare out from the past, a reminder of sacrifice, dedication, and a love for children that not even death could diminish. It's been 3 years now since that October night, when I first encountered the mystery of Room 213. 3 years of night shifts, of watching over sleeping children, of listening to stories that exist in the margins of medical textbooks. St. Catherine's Children's Hospital continues to operate as it always has, saving lives, treating illnesses, providing comfort to families in crisis. But for those of us who know, who've seen, who listen carefully to what the children tell us, it's also something more, a place where the living and the dead collaborate in the work of healing, where dedication transcends mortality, where guardian angels wear old-fashioned nursing uniforms. Catherine Hendricks still appears in room 213, though less frequently than before. The children who see her report that she seems more peaceful now, her sadness replaced by something softer, satisfaction perhaps, or contentment. She still watches over them, still checks equipment with her ghostly gaze, still stands vigil through the long hours of darkness. But she no longer seems trapped by her mission. It's as if being acknowledged, being remembered, being honored for her 70 years of service has given her permission to rest more, to worry less. Several children have told me they've seen her smile, a rare and beautiful expression on her usually somber face. I've become something of a historian for St. Catherine's, collecting stories and preserving the memories of those who've worked here over the decades. I interviewed Catherine Sterling's granddaughter and learned more about the friendship between the two nurses who gave the hospital its character. I tracked down relatives of Thomas Mitchell, the little boy Catherine died trying to save, and learned that his family had never forgotten her sacrifice. I even located a few of the children Catherine successfully evacuated from the 1957 fire, now elderly adults who remembered her courage with crystal clarity. Each story I collected added another layer to my understanding of why Catherine couldn't, or wouldn't, move on. She devoted her life to children, and death hadn't changed that fundamental orientation of her soul. The hospital administration, to their credit, eventually embraced Catherine's story rather than suppressing it. They commissioned a memorial plaque that now hangs in the main lobby, honoring Catherine Hendricks and all the healthcare workers who've dedicated themselves to the hospital's mission. The plaque features her photograph, a brief biography, and a quote from one of her colleagues. She treated every child as if they were her own, with a love that knew no limits. Every new employee at St. Catherine's is told her story during orientation, not as a ghost tale, but as an inspiration, an example of the dedication and sacrifice that defines the best of healthcare work. I still work the night shift, still make my rounds through the quiet hallways where most of the world is asleep. I've learned to trust my intuitions more, to pay attention when something feels off even if I can't immediately explain why. I've learned that children often perceive truths that adults have trained themselves to ignore, and that listening to them, really listening, can reveal insights that no medical scan or laboratory test could provide. I've learned that hospitals are sacred spaces in their own way, repositories of intense human experience, places where the boundaries between life and death, hope and despair, the physical and the spiritual become permeable. Sometimes, late at night when I'm sitting at the nurse's station completing paperwork, I think about Catherine Hendricks and wonder what she experiences in her twilight existence between worlds. Does she still feel the fear she must have felt running back into that burning building? Does she remember the pain of her death? Or has all of that faded, leaving only the pure essence of her purpose? To protect children, to watch over them, to warn of danger? I hope it's the latter. I hope that whatever consciousness she retains is focused on the satisfaction of her mission rather than the tragedy of her death. She deserved that much, at least. Last month, I had a remarkable experience that seemed to confirm everything I'd come to believe about Catherine and St. Catherine's. A 5-year-old girl named Isabella was admitted with severe pneumonia, and she was placed in room 213. Her condition was critical, and we weren't sure she'd make it through the night. I stayed with her, monitoring her oxygen levels and administering medications, while her exhausted parents tried to rest in the waiting room. Around 3 a.m., Isabella's breathing became severely labored, and her oxygen saturation began to drop dangerously. I was preparing to call a code blue when Isabella suddenly opened her eyes and said, clearly and calmly, "The nice nurse says you need to check the oxygen tank. Something's wrong with it." I immediately checked the tank and discovered that the regulator had malfunctioned. It was showing proper flow on the gauge, but wasn't actually delivering oxygen correctly. If Isabella had gone into full respiratory arrest before we discovered the problem, the faulty equipment could have been catastrophic. I quickly switched to a backup oxygen supply, and Isabella's level stabilized. As I was updating her chart, the little girl smiled and said, "The nurse with the old-timey hat says thank you for listening. She says you're a good doctor." I looked at the corner of the room where generations of children had seen Catherine Hendricks, and though I saw nothing, I whispered, "Thank you, Catherine. Thank you for never giving up on them." Isabella recovered fully and was discharged a week later. On her last day, her mother pulled me aside and said something I'll never forget. "Dr. Matthews, Isabella told me about the nurse she saw in her room, the one who warned you about the oxygen tank. She said the nurse told her not to be afraid, that she was watching over her. I know it sounds crazy, but I believe my daughter saw something real, and I'm grateful for it. Whatever she saw, whoever she saw, it saved her life." I assured Isabella's mother that her belief wasn't crazy at all, that many children had similar experiences at St. Catherine's, and that those experiences were part of what made this hospital special. Part 9, The Final Truth. As I write this, sitting in my office at the end of another night shift, dawn is beginning to break through the windows. The hospital is slowly coming to life. The morning shift arriving, families returning to visit their children, the breakfast carts making their rounds. In a few hours, I'll drive home, try to sleep through the day, and return tonight to do it all again. It's a rhythm I've grown to love. This backwards life of working while most people sleep, of being present during the hours when the world is quietest and, perhaps, when the barriers between the seen and unseen are thinnest. I keep Catherine's photograph on my desk, next to pictures of my own family and the various certificates and diplomas that mark my medical career. Sometimes colleagues visiting my office ask about her, and I tell them the story about the fire, about her sacrifice, about the children who still see her. Some people nod politely and change the subject, uncomfortable with discussions of the supernatural. Others lean in, fascinated, and share their own experiences with phenomena they can't quite explain. I've learned to recognize kindred spirits, those individuals who understand that reality is more complex and mysterious than our scientific instruments can measure. The question I get asked most frequently is whether I actually believe in ghosts, whether I think Catherine Hendricks' consciousness truly persists in some form, or whether the sightings are elaborate psychological phenomena. My answer has evolved over the 3 years since I first encountered this mystery. I no longer think the question of belief is the right question. Instead, I ask myself, does it matter? Children are comforted. Staff members are more vigilant. Safety problems are discovered before they cause harm. A hospital has a story that connects its past to its present, that honors sacrifice and dedication. Whether Catherine is a genuine spirit, a collective hallucination, an archetype, or something else entirely doesn't change the profound effect her presence has on this place and the people in it. But if I'm being completely honest, and after everything I've experienced, witnessed, and documented, I owe honesty to anyone reading this account. Yes, I believe that Catherine Hendricks died trying to save a child, and that some essential part of her remained connected to that mission. I believe that consciousness is more than electrical impulses in the brain, that love and dedication can persist beyond the death of the body, that the universe is stranger and more wonderful than our current scientific models acknowledge. I believe because I've seen the pattern too many times to dismiss it. Because I've watched children who had no knowledge of Catherine describe her with perfect consistency. Because I felt the presence in room 213 even though I've never seen it with my eyes. Working in a children's hospital confronts you with profound questions about suffering, mortality, and the nature of existence. Why do children get cancer? Why do accidents steal young lives? What meaning can we find in the face of such tragedy? I don't have complete answers to these questions, but my experiences at St. Catherine's have given me fragments of understanding. I've learned that love doesn't end at death, that sacrifice echoes through time, that consciousness might be far more durable than we imagine. I've learned that children, in their openness and vulnerability, can perceive dimensions of reality that adults have learned to filter out. And I've learned that healing is a collaborative effort involving not just the living, but perhaps those who've gone before us, whose dedication to their mission continue beyond their final breath. 3 years ago, I was a conventional doctor who believed in evidence-based medicine, peer-reviewed studies, and the supremacy of rational scientific thinking. I still believe in all of those things. They're essential tools in the practice of medicine. But I've also learned that they're not the only tools, that healing involves dimensions of human experience that transcend the purely physical. The mind affects the body, belief influences outcomes, hope strengthens immune systems, and sometimes, just sometimes, love persists beyond death to watch over those who need protection. None of this contradicts good medicine. It complements it, adds layers of meaning and possibility to what we do. I've started writing a book about my experiences, though I'm not sure if I'll ever publish it. The medical establishment isn't quite ready for a doctor who takes ghost stories seriously, who validates children's perceptions of spirits, who suggests that hospitals might be inhabited by guardian presences. But the book helps me process what I've experienced and learned, and perhaps someday the cultural climate will shift enough that these discussions can happen openly. In the meantime, I continue my work at St. Catherine's, watching over children to the long hours of darkness, listening carefully when they tell me about visitors I can't see, and honoring the legacy of a nurse who loved children so much that not even death could make her stop caring for them. Room 213 was repainted again last month, a soft blue this time instead of yellow, but Catherine still appears there regularly. The latest sighting was just last week, reported by twin brothers recovering from a car accident. They described her with the now familiar details. White uniform, white cap, sad face that brightened when they acknowledged her. She wanted us to know we're going to be okay. One of the boys told me. She said we're safe now. And they were right. Both boys made full recoveries and went home to their relieved parents. Whether Catherine actually communicated that message or whether the boys intuited it from her peaceful presence doesn't matter. They felt reassured, protected, cared for. That's what matters. Sometimes I think about what will happen to Catherine when St. Catherine's Children's Hospital eventually closes, as all institutions eventually do. Will she finally be able to rest, her mission complete, or will she find another hospital, another pediatric ward where children need a guardian? I like to imagine that she'll finally cross over to wherever souls go after their work in this world is done, reunited with Thomas Mitchell and her own son, free from the weight of her vigilant duty. But I also suspect that if children somewhere are in danger, Catherine Hendricks will be there, watching over them with the same dedication she showed in life and has continued to show in death. Some commitments are eternal, some love is truly unconditional, and some heroes never stop serving. As for me, I'll continue working these night shifts, walking these hallways, caring for these children. I'll keep telling Catherine's story to anyone who'll listen, preserving her memory and honoring her sacrifice. I'll remain open to experiences that challenge my understanding of reality, willing to listen when children report seeing things I cannot. And every time I pass room 213, I'll pause for just a moment and whisper a silent thanks to a nurse who died 70 years ago, but who still hasn't given up on protecting the vulnerable, the sick, the frightened children who pass through these halls. The sun is fully up now, streaming through my office window, and my shift is officially over. But before I head home, I'll make one last round to the 4th floor, checking on the night's patients, ensuring everything is secure. And if I happen to feel a presence in room 213, if I happen to sense something watching over the children with eternal vigilance, I'll acknowledge it with gratitude. Because whether we call it a ghost, a guardian angel, an echo of the past, or simply the persistence of extraordinary dedication, Catherine Hendricks is still here, still watching, still protecting. And I, for one, am grateful that she never gave up on us. The children are safe. That's what matters most. That's what has always mattered most. And as long as Catherine Hendricks continues her watch, I believe they always will be.